Namaskar and welcome to this exciting episode of Sattology Debunking Mythology. Sattology means science of truth or study of truth. Opposite of that is mythology, which means the science of fake lie or imagination. Somehow the connotation of the word mythology goes as ancient history whose sources are not verified. And I'll shock you. In Guatemala, in Belize, there are ancient temples, ruins of the ancient temples, whose doors have been permanently closed. I don't know why. I think the only reason it's no why is so that the natives do not practice their original cultures and they can go to the nearby church. And unfortunately, the churches are within 1 mile radius of those ancient structures. Those ancient structures are known to be 300 BC to 600 BC. But and we still call the natives as not developed or not, they were not civilized. If they were not civilized, how could they build such huge structures with such mathematical precision? So this is a point to think about. Read in my book Gold, Glory, and God. You'll find a lot of details about that. I have a very special guest. He's a French journalist, lives in New Delhi, is more like an Indian, thinks like an Indian, lives and but he's a French national. So without delay, let us welcome and very good friend of mine. Without delay, let us welcome Sri Carpentier.
Namaskar. Good morning, America.
Good morning, and it's good evening for you. Beginning evening for you. It's 5:45 p.m. So my when you talk about perceptions, the whole world works on perceptions, and that's how the images are made in perceptions. So what do you think of is the recent US perception in the world? You travel across the world. You were in France recently and you're traveling to other European countries, and now you're back in India and you attended a big conference in Bangalore. So what is the world's perception about the US? Because most Americans don't know anything about that from their media channels.
There is no doubt that the perception of the US has evolved over the last few years according to the situation that has prevailed both in the US and internationally. As a matter of fact, there have been a number of matters that have, I would say, gone wrong with the US. Number one, of course, you can talk about the foreign policy, the growing difficulties the US is experiencing in terms of its debt, of its trade deficit, of the decline in its industrial productivity, and also the growing suspicion that many of its policies are generating, especially with regard, for example, to the dominance of its high-tech companies, the so-called GAFAM, which behave in many ways as monopolies worldwide, and which enforce not only a particular kind of approach or ideology, but also very openly censor those who do not agree with them, and simply take the liberty to cut them off and to deny them service for all sorts of reasons, whether it's the President of the United States, Donald Trump, or some unknown person in some foreign country who should not be submitted to US views and rules, even if he is or she is using US manufactured or at least US promoted and developed networks, platforms. So all those things are widely discussed, and they generally lead to an unfavorable view of what the US has become. Not US people per se, obviously, but the US state machinery, the leading corporations, US policies in general. Now, if you look at the news that are coming from the US, so many of them are astonishingly negative. You see the proliferation of mass shootings, the racist, growing racist ideologies and the people who support them, the very unseemly political fight between Democrats and Republicans, between Trumpians and anti-Trumpians, between what is often known as the far right and what definitely qualifies as the woke far left. And basically, it seems to many observers that America is coming apart at the seams. And that is, of course, becoming a leitmotif. In fact, you hear it at all conferences. I was recently at that Ideas India conclave in Bangalore, which was a big show with a number of ministers being present, as well as high officials. And the chief economic advisor to the prime minister, Mr. Nageshwaran, said that what we had witnessed, and he said that on record in his speech, what the world had been witnessing in the last few years is an astonishing level of stupidity in terms of American economic policies. So you see, when officials in a country which is traditionally pro-US end up speaking like this, you realize that something is terribly wrong with the way America is going at present.
There is you know better than me, and I live here, and I'm a citizen here. So some of the issues that I have always had problems with classifying countries as first world, second world, and third world. And unfortunately, most of the American streets look like their own definition of third world. What do you have to say on that? Because the world is noticing that, and I have seen a perceptive decline in the American society and the infrastructure also significantly. In last 15 years, I have seen it has completely come down. What it was 15 years back, and we used to be proud of everything here, but now it seems that the world has caught up. And so the third world and first world differences are reducing day by day, including in Africa. What do you have to think?
I lived in the US in the 80s. And so I knew the US well. And at that time, let's put it this way, it had major problems and things were going wrong in certain respects. But by and large, you had the sense that this was a strong and prosperous country where, by and large, people could make a decent living, and where there were many islands of academic excellence and culture. However, in the last 20 years and 30 years, perhaps, through a succession of bad administrations and wrong-headed policies, that capital, which had been built over, let's say, the last 2 centuries, gradually through the 19th century, especially after the Civil War, and through the first half of the 20th century, all that capital, both human and technological, has been partly wasted on a very, I would say, corrupt set of priorities, which with the vain attempt to expand and keep some sort of a military empire, which is based on some rather utopian ideology that America is the Republic of Freedom and it has a bounden duty to expand the freedom, whatever that means, to the rest of the world, which means make the world like America. And yet at the same time, dilapidating its own resources by spending gigantic amount of money on the military budget with very few perceptible positive results, and entrusting simultaneously its production tools to foreign countries, whether it be Mexico, South American countries, China in particular, Japan. More and more, America has become a country of consumers who live on credit, with a government that's massively over-indebted, and that has simply no clue and no way of repaying its debt, which is built up on the basis that you can print as many dollars as you want. That's called the exorbitant privilege of the US Treasury, which actually relies, essentially rests with the Federal Reserve. And essentially it means that as long as you have zero interest, you don't have to pay any interest and you never repay the capital, so you can keep printing money. But there is a point where you have to raise the interest because nobody trusts the dollar so as much as they did before. And therefore, to raise interest, then you start finding yourself before unmanageable difficulties because you have to repay enormous amounts of debt, which means you will simply not have enough to cover your own basic costs. And given that the military will always have priority, the civilian infrastructure is being neglected, the public services are being devastated, education is essentially abandoned unless people can pay for it, which becomes more and more expensive. And as a result, you create an enormous lumpen proletariat, which lives hand to mouth and is on the brink of either famine or rebellion. And that is what is happening in the US. It's a very dire situation. It's not the first country in history that has come to that stage. But let's face it, it is the country that has come to that stage at the largest scale, because you never had such a gigantic economy and such a gigantic country that has led itself to be put in that situation.
So I know you have a grasp over these financial economics issues actually, and you put on a very important point for me to ask you. So does the world think that the US use their military to prop up their dollar? Because dollar has no gold basis, and it is a, what do you call it? It is a fiat where it is works on the global acceptability of dollar through American sanctions. So American sanctions play an important role, and because the credit situation is so fluid, so everyone can sell to Americans and earn in dollars, and that's how it maintains the value of the dollar. Do you think that way it is happening?
Yes, well, clearly this situation is not tenable over the long term. In fact, it's a miracle that it has been relatively static, not stable, static for the last 30 years. What I mean static, I mean that the same mechanism has been at work, and despite the vertiginous increment in the debt, you haven't noticed any major changes. Of course, you have. Now you're beginning to notice them, but we expected them, some of us, 10, 15 years ago, and they took that much longer to come home to roost. So what is happening now is that the US basically has no other weapon than its military and its sanctions, which essentially are another way of using the military, because when you impose sanctions, you are showing the stick and saying, if you don't go by these sanctions, you are going to be hit in some other way. Now, that in itself shows the failure of other traditional recourses that America always had. And what is worse, and in fact, this was discussed in the presence of Indian cabinet ministers a few days ago in Bangalore at that conference, is that the US is simply breaking all its own rules. When it talks about a rules-based order, I think it prefers to say rules and laws, because the rules are set by the US and its allies, therefore they feel more comfortable with them. But the fact is that the US and its closest allies, such as the United Kingdom, are happily breaking those rules whenever, for example, they decide that a country should be sanctioned, and therefore its assets should be frozen, and anything that belongs to them or even to private citizens can be essentially grabbed by the US federal agencies. Now, this is, by any standards, piracy. And I'm sorry to say it that way, but that's what it is. And you can say all you want against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Let's face it, Russia is not the first country which has been waging war over in another country in the last decades. Several countries have done it, and primarily the US and its closest allies. So suddenly to decide that Russia has committed an unforgivable crime, nothing like that was said when America attacked Iraq and fostered the insurrection in Syria, or when it carried out military activities against Iran. Nothing was ever said of that type, and even if it was said, nothing was done about it in the way that the US is now acting against Russia. You cannot freeze the assets of a sovereign central bank simply because you disagree with the policies of that country. Clearly, if the US were an ally of the United States and were waging war, such sanctions would never have been applied, nor even considered. I mean, I can give other examples, like Saudi Arabia fighting in Yemen and obviously carrying out extensive bombings in Yemen and killing tens of thousands of civilians, and also indirectly or directly causing famine in Yemen. Yet there has never been any question of sanctioning Saudi Arabia, nor even restricting the flow of weapons to Saudi Arabia. So why are these extreme sanctions taken against Russia? This is not about humanitarian considerations. This is about sheer and naked geostrategic concerns. The US simply wants Russia to be brought down, and therefore it wants Russia to be punished in such a way that its economy crumbles and that possibly Russia breaks up. And clearly, this is a war process. And let's put it this way: if you are going to break the international order by seizing whatever assets of a country, and not only of a country, but of people who happen to belong to that country, we can all disagree about Russian oligarchs and the way that they acquire their wealth. But you know, there is a joke in Russia that when a very rich man is Russian, he's called an oligarch, and when he's an American, he's called a billionaire philanthropist. So that's probably the difference, which is rather cosmetic. But anyway, the fact is that this has created enormous worry and disarray in the world, because countries realize that the US will attack any country with which it has a serious disagreement in any way it wants, and that the people of that country will be victimized directly by the US, simply because they carry the passport of a particular country.
You know, you put it so clearly, actually, because this is what the world is thinking. The second aspect comes in here, that the US internally hates the left, but it promotes the left in other countries to break up. Classical example is Thailand. Thailand, I mean, a leftist organization is promoted, which is communist also, and far right, and they're promoting it. Sorry, far left, they're promoting it. But within the US, majority of Americans hate the left. Majority, and I think this will be shown in the upcoming midterms also. So is this hypocrisy also being perceived by the world, or they know about it?
It's a long-standing policy, purely on opportunistic considerations. If you go back to the earlier 20th century, you can see that the US in some ways supported certain left-wing movements. It did so, for example, in Mexico at certain times, and in particular in what was the Russian Empire, or at least what has been the Russian Empire, when it was taken over by the Bolsheviks. There was a strong link between some of the Bolshevik leaders and US financial and corporate interests. This is well known, and it is also well established that when Leon Trotsky took refuge in Mexico, he was protected by certain US interests, in particular the Rockefeller organizations. What would that be for? Well, clearly because there was some gain to be made from a collapsing state, and the hope was that the Soviet Union, or the future of Soviet Union, which was taking shape at the time, might be structured to the advantage of US business. So what we are seeing today with regard to left-wing support to left-wing forces is not new. You can also see that there is support for left-wing forces in India from the US. I'm not saying that all the US government or private entities support leftist entities in India, by no means, but definitely there are certain sectors, call them the NGOs, sometimes the intelligence community. There is not always a clear distinction between the two. You will see that they do support certain leftist forces. Why? Because it weakens India, makes it more vulnerable, promotes internal division. And some of those so-called leftist forces, such as, for example, the Greens in Europe, and even some of the socialists in Europe, in fact, I would say now the majority of the socialists in Europe, are in fact, knowingly or unknowingly, by and large, supporting US policies, whether it's in Ukraine or it's with regard to internal matters.
You know, one question comes in to tie to the last one, and you were recently in the economic conference over there. And Bernie Sanders said the American oligarchs, he used the word American oligarch, Bernie Sanders, but he is considered far left socialist. Now, in the economic space, we see a complete domination of American financial institutions or American supported financial institutions, including SWIFT, and withholding of almost $300 billion of Russia, which was paid in advance to settle international debts. And do you think that the world feels threatened by such kind of action? Because I clearly saw African Union opposing that they cannot trust the US in any way because they can block any country's money. First it was Afghanistan, then it was Russia, and now and we don't know what's going to happen. Do you think that was a discussion done in that conference also in India, or it's on
It
the
was certain,
sidelines?
it was discussed both in the sidelines and in some of the sessions, because this is a long-standing problem in the sense that you mentioned the cases of Afghanistan and Russia, but go back and to in history and see Iran, see other countries, Venezuela, which have been also financially paralyzed and gravely hurt by US measures. Now, for many years, the world was not able or willing to really focus on that, simply because there was a sense that the US was too strong to be opposed, and also because many of those countries were rather not viewed with favor. So many felt that perhaps their actions had attracted that kind of retaliation. And the West can be also quite self-centered. So when sanctions affect uh, countries elsewhere in Africa or in the Middle East, they think that this is not really a major concern and that poor countries should just learn to live with these harsh realities of the world order. But when it begins to affect major countries in the West, then that, of course, becomes a very great worry. And I can tell you that there are states like Germany, which are so far have tried to remain under the US umbrella and do business with some reliance on the American protection. But now they are really getting very worried that America is actually directly hitting at German prosperity and trying to bring Germany down. I think this is partly caused by the British influence on US policy, because Britain's long-standing policy has been to weaken uh, Europe as a continent, continental Europe, and also particularly Germany. You remember Churchill's old adage about NATO. What is NATO for? To keep the US in and Britain in, of course, to keep Germany down and to keep Russia or the Soviet Union at the time out. And NATO hasn't changed its spots. It's still doing the same thing. And the US is using NATO for that purpose. So as a result, what we are seeing now on the part of Germany is a feeling that they have gotten themselves into big trouble, because they tried to play both sides. They tried to do great business with Russia and make a lot of their economy rely on Russian cheap energy, which is very conveniently delivered by pipelines, so without the need of tankers. And yet they expected the US to support and protect them, they are being, of course, the key member of NATO. However, now they find that they are torn between the two sides, and the Americans are basically trying to strangle them by cutting them off from Russia. And of course, Russia is retaliating by saying, well, in that case, then you'll have to pay the oil and gas in rubles, and the rubles are backed by gold, which means the value of the rubles is rising while the dollar value is going down, as shown by the inflation, which is now raging in the US, while the euro is also creating massive inflation in Europe.
One of the key questions which has come from the audience right now, the live audience, they are asking is, one of the questions is that France has remained, so the impact of global, all this US turmoil, the Western turmoil again, like the after colonization, now this is a second, then World War One, World War Two, and now this one, and other conflicts also. The world is seeing that the West has created conflicts and put global economic security under, uh, damaged global economic security. And now with the world has realized also very soon, and I can see it myself also, many Americans are questioning it, that we are becoming a problem for the whole world. And you are also saying it very clearly. So how does it impact India? Because does India has India learned a lesson that all their dollars stored in the American banks and the British banks, including gold, a lot of gold of Indian banks is stored in the British Bank of England actually. So is that secure in future? If there is something disagreement in India and the West, then the only ally India has left is France, actually. No one else. No, because France is the only independent country there. So what does the Indians think? Because you were in that conference over there.
Would not consider France to be really independent now. It's very much part of both the EU and the NATO systems, and both systems are monitored and controlled from the US and to a certain extent from its ally Britain. Plus, there are other factors which are always playing in favor of the US interests, such as Israel, which has a very active role in Europe and, in fact, all over the world. Now, as far as your question about how India feels, I think India has been trying to, in every possible way, keep a positive relation with the US and generate enough stakes for the US not to want to hurt India. In the sense, India has also learned perhaps a lesson from China. China's strategy was to make the US so interdependent with itself that the US would have great trouble imposing really harsh sanctions on China. In the sense, if the US wanted to treat China like it's treating Russia now, the US would probably in some way be committing harakiri, because the damage to the US economy would be so great that no government could take it, short of engaging in the Third World War. So India feels that perhaps, given the importance of India in the Indo-Pacific, and also the possible importance of India for US investments, growing importance of India for US investments abroad and for US exports, but also for US imports, which are expected to grow from India, that the US would remain, I would say, lenient towards India, even when clearly the US sees with some concern the possibility that India could become a second China. We were talking about that at that conference, and many of the top economists in the country and several cabinet ministers were reflecting the very optimistic view that within 10, 15 years, India would be the third, if not the second economy in the world, and that it would therefore be a unchallengeable power economically and perhaps strategically as well. We're talking about the years between now and 2047, the centenary of India's independence. So that consideration, of course, in the short term is all in the interest of the US because it creates a balancer to China. But in the longer term, it becomes a worry to both the US and the West. And what you have seen recently, I know you were going to bring this up, but I'm going to do it before you, is in the recent discussions that were held between G7 countries. I mean, there was recently a meeting of the finance ministers of the G7 countries, and they are preparing the summit of G7. And the goal there is to, India is invited, by the way, as a guest. The goal is to try to re-establish the G7 as the center of global policy making and basically sync the G20. Because the G20 is inconvenient because it has a lot of adversarial countries like Russia, China, and now unreliable countries like Saudi Arabia, even Indonesia, not to mention India, which tends to follow its own path, Brazil, which is also quite undependable as far as the West is concerned. So because of that, G20 is becoming a nuisance, and there is already talk of a boycott by all Western nations on the basis of the fact that Russia is, of course, invited as a member. So not to mention that China refuses to disinvite Russia, therefore the whole thing is becoming very unpleasant to the West. And that shows you that there is a return to what you might call the old world thinking of a few Western countries controlling the, if not the narrative, at least controlling the way things go, with the support of a non-Western country, Japan, and so on. But of course, the question is that viable? And will that be accepted? Of course, it won't be. We can see now Biden trying to set up in Japan a new Asia-Pacific economic framework in order to fight the China-led comprehensive economic partnership which gathers most East Asian countries around China. And then, of course, you have the Quad, but the Quad was found to be somewhat wishy-washy because India would not want the Quad to become simply a military alliance against China. And given that the US and Britain are now trying to make the Quad part of a global NATO, which is directed against Russia, which India would not accept, then they have set up AUKUS, which means only Britain, the US, and Australia. And now there is some talk that they might invite Japan, but they, of course, won't invite India because India would not want to be part of that sort of military alliance. As a result, the Quad is probably losing relevance. And now they are talking about vaccines and ecology and sort of non-controversial topics. So it means that the Quad is losing steam as we speak. And the US is now trying to rely on its traditional allies with the former members of the British Empire, I mean, essentially Western countries, and of course, Japan, which is still, let's face it, under American military occupation.
You know, in one of the earlier conversations, you touched upon the tech dominance and how the American tech dominance, like the Facebook, the Google, the GPS, and Twitter, obviously. Now, all these things are used as a tool now to control the conversations across the world, not just in the US. In the US, it has banned their own president, last president. And we recently find out that Biden has 20 million fake followers, bots. And so now the 50% of Biden's popularity has gone on Twitter. So now we're seeing all these trends, and we all know that how Facebook is very strongly monitored by the FBI as well as CIA. Now across the world, they know who is living, who is riding a bike, and where it is going, and who is where exactly. So don't you think it's a challenge for countries like India and other countries which feel overwhelmed? And unfortunately, they've accepted it also. There are no laws in other countries which can ban, other than Russia and China. No country has banned them. So what was the view in the conference, on the sidelines, as well as in the main forum on this aspect?
This was one of the main topics. And I must say that many of the professionals, but also people from the media and from the cultural and academic world, were generally in favor of setting guidelines and rules for those international or transnational corporations. And of course, the requirement would be, the first requirement would be that their platforms and their data are based in the country in which they operate, in this case, India. And that naturally, this is a problem in all over the world too, that they pay taxes in the country where they operate, and that they are accountable to the government in which they are operating. Now, as you also know, under which they are operating. As you know, G7 has criticized India recently for restricting access of data companies, or call them, you know, the so-called IT companies to the country, and trying to regulate them, which they said prevents freedom of expression, which of course is very cynical, because we all know that the European Union and the US have first severely restricted, for example, Russian media, and now have banned them altogether. So obviously they will do their own censoring when they feel it's important for their policies. And therefore, they can hardly ask other countries to keep an open door to whatever they want to push onto them. So I think there is an awareness of that in India. I think the concern in India is always not to get into an actual confrontation with the US whenever it can be avoided. How much longer it can be avoided, I don't know, because you see, if you look at India's peculiar position, it's a member of the BRICS and a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And yet, at the same time, it's also a member of we have already talked about the Quad, and also now about that new Asia-Pacific economic framework, which is clearly anti-Chinese and run by the United States and its allies. So the question is, will India be able to keep that position? Because the US are obviously putting increasing pressure on New Delhi to drop the Shanghai Cooperation Association and perhaps the BRICS as well, saying these things are useless, so just come with us. Now, the question is, India, if you look very realistically, discard any kind of sympathy or antipathy you may have, you will see that India has a lot to lose if it goes out of BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, simply because that would cut India off from Central Asia, and it would make it much more difficult to do business with countries like Iran. And therefore, in a way, India would be even more isolated in its peninsula, if you see what I mean, because India is bound by Pakistan, Bangladesh, Burma, and it has the Himalayas in the north and China behind. So if India wants to be a player in the continental economy, it has to be using vehicles, whether or not it agrees with China and whether it can always agree with Russia. Whereas if it only relies on the American promoted vehicles, clearly there is no guarantee as to what it will gain from that. And it will lose very vital economic and strategic assets, which I've just mentioned. Therefore, objectively, India's ideal position is to remain on both sides simultaneously. But if that's not possible, then the hard choice will be there. And so far, the government of India has avoided making that choice. I hope they can continue to avoid it. So this being said, there is no question that as far as the US is concerned, you know, what is also making countries like India very hesitant, skeptical, or jaded about the US is that you have seen that all the power of the US, that enormous power they have, especially in their military, but also in their high-tech corporations, all that power seems to be just useless as far as pursuing sensible policies. I mean, the US, after fighting the Taliban for 20 years and spending incalculable amounts of money and lives, has simply given up Afghanistan to the Taliban and has simply no other way now to influence them except by holding their money, which, by the way, is also grossly illegal. If you are going to let a particular organization regain control with full support, full consent, how can you possibly deprive them of their own money and say, well, you know, it's all right, you have the government, but we don't want you to have the money because somehow we don't like you, even though we negotiated with you for years while fighting you. And then you see the same kind of policies with Iran. You want to make a deal with Iran? Yes, we do, but Israel won't let us, so we won't. Meanwhile, you are upsetting Saudi Arabia, and then you are claiming that you are going to abandon the Middle East and move to the Pacific so that you're upsetting China. On the one hand, you support the one China policy, which means Taiwan is not an independent country, but yet Biden just said that if China attacks Taiwan, then the US will defend Taiwan. And then, of course, it was found to be a blunder because that runs contrary to the US professed policies. So as usual, the State Department had to correct Biden, who probably doesn't know what the real situation is. And they have to say, no, no, we only will send weapons to Taiwan, which means they will recreate the Ukrainian situation. You don't want to fight, but you don't want peace. So what you keep doing is supporting the war by sending weaponry to make sure more and more people get killed. Of course, you sell weapons, which is good for you. You make loans, which will be repaid. Therefore, you put Ukraine in debt for many years to come to you. And therefore, all you are doing is essentially pursuing narrow-minded, myopic self-interest and sacrificing the welfare of enormous parts of the world, if not the whole world itself, to that. You know, so that's completely untenable for a global power. I mean, if you want to be an empire, you must have a certain amount of global thinking, if not cosmic thinking. And what you are seeing here is a very petty-minded, selfish, greedy, essentially vengeful policy, which you know, you would expect from some sort of a middle-sized dictatorship, but not from the United States. And unfortunately, if you add to that the internal confusion and disarray in the US, you have a perfect recipe for essentially losing the respect of the world and making a complete joke of your government.
The US government works with leverages, like leverages win some weak points, and that's how they twist you and they force you. So, do you think a new colonization era has started? Again, the same grouping of the West, the Britain and the NATO, and these are becoming a bigger organizations than the UN itself now, because they can wage wars at will. It's a new era of colonization, and the Asia and every other country is like a second rung. So I mean, they have to follow what the West has telling them. And is there a chance that because the East has been very careful about their independence, they have gone through what colonization has done to them, including India. India was the biggest, what do you call it? The India was hurt the most by everybody. They looted India like left, right, and center. So, do you think is a chance of the Eastern NATO without the West, because that will really bring stability to the world? Do you think the idea of that has come?
The idea is there because Russia has basically set it up, and you might say that incipiently, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization could become that. Although, of course, there are major difficulties because many of those countries that are members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization do not agree. Particularly, you have the conflict between India and China, which it seems not to be insolvable because, after all, it's mostly the Chinese. Sometimes you might say obduracy about its claimed borders and its rights on certain territories that it keeps upholding, even though they are highly questionable and sometimes they are not legally valid internationally. Yet this is what creates the major problem, the border issue between India and China. Otherwise, there could easily be cooperation that could be, of course, extremely beneficial to the Asian and developing countries in general, and would put a limit to the Western dominance, which is no longer so obvious. As a matter of fact, I think we are not going to see a new colonization, or if we do, it will be rival colonizations as was in the past between, you might say, US colonization, whatever colonization Europe can still undertake, which is very limited. We know that European countries are being gradually pushed out of Africa. And against that, you will have Chinese colonization and to a certain extent Russian colonization and perhaps Brazilian colonization and even Indian colonization as far as the economy. If you look at Africa or if you look at certain Southeast Asian countries, or if you look at even Latin America, where you have a lot of capital, primarily from China, but now from other parts of the world that's coming in, and therefore taking a certain influence in those countries. So these rival colonizations are definitely going to take place. But fortunately, if history teaches any lessons, it is that there comes a point when the dominant position of a hegemon is no longer tenable because there are rivals that are too powerful and they challenge it, and that ends up in war. It happened in World War I, it happened in World War II, it happened much before in history with the great empires we have known. And I think, unfortunately, we are seeing it happening now with what's happening in Ukraine. Now, what Russia is doing in Ukraine, I'm not going into might say the tactical facts, because that can be highly controversial and it's not easy to approve of any invasion. I would say I wouldn't get into that. But you have to look beyond it and see that what Russia is effectively doing is fighting a Western policy strategy through NATO of somehow cornering Russia, corralling it, and perhaps breaking it up. Now, it's very difficult to understand that for many Western countries, but technically, Ukraine is to Russia what Alsace-Lorraine was to France. It was part of a territory which the French were willing to die for. And you say, well, why the hell would they want to die for it? Let Germany have it, after all. Those people speak a variant of German. And there is no particular reason why they should be French beyond the fact that France conquered them in the 17th century. So, that is, again, it's a very peculiar thing. Why is Brittany French? I mean, Brittany was a dukedom and independent, and probably culturally was closer to Britain, to Great Britain, to islands, than to France. Yet it became French. And so when, I don't know if Americans would say the same about Texas, if Texas goes its own way and the Americans decide that this is quite intolerable, and decide that they have to fight a new civil war to keep it in the Union. So we see these situations which seem unreasonable, but which are very real from the human instinct. And therefore, I can see why Russia is doing this, which to the West sounds criminal, illogical, crazy. Yet for the Russians, it's very much a vital thing. And you just have to look at the name Ukraine. In Russian, Ukraine means the border, right? So the Ukrainians are border people. Now, why should the border be a country? That in itself is almost a contradiction. Now, I'm being provocative here. But, there is another place which carries the same name, which is called Ukraine, and which is now in Serbia. It was part of Yugoslavia. And it's right on the border with Hungary, and it used to be part of Hungary. So there is always that issue, should Krajina be with Serbia or with Hungary? And there are lots of lands like that. For example, Germany would love to get back Kaliningrad, which is the former East Prussia. And Poland thinks it should get back part of Ukraine. Hungary also wants a piece of the Ukraine back, So basically, this is not a unique Russian quirk, It's very much part of the mental makeup, and it's part of geostrategy since probably history began. So I don't know what will happen with this war, but I think the American intent of perpetuating it and creating a wider and wider conflict and killing more and more people by forcing Russia to spend more and more forces in Ukraine is not only full-headed. I mean, it's just completely counterproductive, and it is just negative and destructive.
Thank you so much, Mr. Carpentier. I know we are scheduled for 35 minutes. We went overboard because your answers are so straightforward and so good. And so I think that it will be a good learning for many of the students who are watching, and also people who are watching on the YouTube. And thank you so much for coming on the show today. Namaste and thank you.
Namaste. Nice to talk to you. Bye.